And we are back. Another edition of Kevin's Corner. I'm Kevin Bowen. Eddie Garrison is with me. As always, apologies, been a little bit longer than I would like in between these off-season pods. We're going to continue to stick to one a week, but some scheduling logistics has pushed us back a little bit later this week. As expected, pretty quiet start to the offseason for the Colts. Honestly, they'd probably fall under one of the quieter offseason teams here so far. Today's podcast, just want to focus kind of on maybe a little bit more logistical offseason items. Go over the list of free agents. Let's take an early look at next year's opponents. I do think both of those areas look a lot different than they do on an annual basis, and they certainly look a lot different than what you had last year. I think the schedule is tougher, certainly better quarterback play than you had last year. And then free agency-wise, I cannot recall a free agency class that has had this many names. I mean, Eddie, I seem to remember one of the years, probably a couple of years ago, I sat here and thought to myself, is there one free agent you'd stand on a table for? And this year, you could probably stand on a table for 4 of them. And I even think there's like a second tier of free agents that no one's talking about that I'm like, wait, those guys played pretty quality football for the Colts, or have played pretty quality football for the Colts as well. So we'll get into that. As always, off-season questions. We'll sprinkle in a few throughout the weeks, ones that are very, much more pertinent. We'll certainly key in on that. So a little bit earlier in the pods. Eddie Garrison, how you doing, man?
Doing well. Just glad to be back in the studio talking about some Colts football a little bit and getting back to a little bit of a normal routine with you. Yes.
Again, off-season wise, if you're looking at kind of dates to keep an eye on, we are now less than a month away from the franchise tag window opening up. That'll be February 20th. So we are less than, 4 weeks away? 1, 2, 3, 4. Yeah, it would have been 4 weeks ago yesterday. That's probably the first big item of note. The combine, of course, will follow the weekend or the week after that. And then the franchise tag window is a 2-week period that ends on March 5th, and then free agency March 13th. So I still think, Eddie, we could get some dominoes from a head coaching standpoint. I'm not 1,000% sold on the Colts having like full staff retention by any means this season. And, as we record this late on Wednesday morning, again, we are, still at a point of, 5 head coach openings, I believe is correct. Brian Callahan with Tennessee, a guy that I liked during last year's cycle, the quarterback background of Burrow and Derek Carr and Peyton Manning and Matthew Stafford is pretty good. So I get a lot why Tennessee decided to go that route there for their new head coach when you consider the Will Levis development that is paramount for them there. So, again, some dominoes could happen with coaching staffs around the league as they get filled. But, yeah, that's about it, really. News item-wise, again, it's been quiet here for the Colts. Not a bad thing. I
want to start here before we get into the opponents. I know it's something we talked about on our last podcast regarding the health of Jim Irsay. I know we have fans that are not only here within Indiana and Indianapolis, but around the United States and certainly around the world as well that may not be aware of what's going on with Jim right now. Do you have any update on the status or health of the Colts owner?
Yeah, nothing official on that front. I'll probably stick by kind of something that I said on last week's podcast. I think we might have had one Irsay-related question. Maybe we didn't for this week's pod, but I know it sounds cliche, but thoughts and prayers are with Jim Irsay and his family. I think, Eddie, and if you just want to read tea leaves, when a organization sends out a press release of severe respiratory illness, severe, I would say, is a big word there. I've got friends and friends' parents that are of a similar age of Jim Irsay that certainly don't have the same sort of health, concerns that Jim has had over the years. When you're in your mid-60s and you have a severe respiratory illness this time of year, that's a big deal. And when was that last update? Was that about 2 weeks ago from the Colts?
Well, there was one issued after the TMZ report, which I think was last week, correct?
Right, and just kind of stood by the first statement there. And the first statement was released, I think it was on the Tuesday after the season ended. So, again, speculation is abound, and I would just say that Jim Irsay and his family need your thoughts, need your prayers there. And when something official is needed to be passed along, we'll certainly do that. But, yeah, I kind of forget how much we got into last week. I guess I'll just reiterate. Jim Irsay is one of the more passionate humans I've ever come across, certainly about his football team. I would say more so than many, if not any, or not all of the owners out there in the league. Eddie, that was the biggest home game this stadium has had in 9 years, that game against the Texans. And for Jim Irsay to have not been seen at that game is jarring, frankly. I had heard some whispers around Christmas of him dealing with something, and all of a sudden when I didn't see him at the Raiders game and then not at that Texans game, I'm like, oh my, this is serious. So, thinking about the Irsay family and Carly and Casey and Kalen and everybody, Pete Ward and everybody else involved with the Colts organization.
With that being said, let's take a look now at the 2024 opponents for the Indianapolis Colts. I know we did this when it was first released, but here are the home opponents for the Colts. Obviously, the divisional teams. Additionally, the Steelers, the Miami Dolphins, the Buffalo Bills, the Detroit Lions, and the Chicago Bears will all be coming to Lucas Oil Stadium. And the Indianapolis Colts will be going to the divisional opponents, the New York Giants, the New York Jets, the New England Patriots, the Green Bay Packers, the Minnesota Vikings, and the Denver Broncos. What are your overall thoughts?
Tougher, much tougher, especially at home, Eddie. You only play one double-digit win team from last season on the road. You got 9 road games, and only one of those teams won double-digit games last season. Eddie, of your 8 home games, 5 of the 8 are against double-digit win teams. In your own building, you're going to get C.J. Stroud. You're going to get Josh Allen. You're going to get Trevor Lawrence. You're going to get Jared Goff. You're going to get Tua. So that schedule at home, again, really stands out to me. From a traveling standpoint, nothing too abundant. Denver's the longest road trip. So you don't have any road trips to the Pacific time zone, and I would say in all likelihood you're not playing an international game. Honestly, one thing that stands out about the road schedule is, and boy, players have got to hate this, how about 2 trips to MetLife in one stadium? Talk about that turf.
Mm-hmm.
You hate to go down that path too early, but that is not ideal with playing the Jets and the Giants both on the road. So, AFC East, NFC North, those are your divisional matchups for this season. Your crossover games based off finishing 3rd in the division will be the Giants, Broncos, and Steelers. And I was thinking about this as the playoffs unfolded, Eddie. Of the 8 teams we just saw play in the divisional round, you're going to face 4 of those quarterbacks in 5 games in total. C.J. Stroud, of course, being 2 of them, and then Jared Goff, Josh Allen, and Jordan Love. So certainly, I know it doesn't have Mahomes or it doesn't have Herbert or it doesn't have Burrow or Lamar, but still, I think from a quarterback standpoint, it is a pretty juicy schedule. Certainly much juicier than what you had this past season. I was doing a story a couple weeks ago and was kind of getting into a quarterback rabbit hole of just schedule-wise and what you faced last year compared to this year. Eddie, last year I think you faced, of the 17 games you played, I want to say 10 of them were against rookie or backup quarterbacks. And I think of the top 15 passers, I want to say, I think you had maybe 2 of the 15. In this coming season, you'll play 5 of the 15. So, again, injuries are going to happen, certainly, but much, much more difficult schedule than, what you faced this past year. So, that is a little look. Obviously, we'll get in May. We'll get some hardcore dates slotted in there. But I think just from an opponent standpoint, it is much more difficult than you had this past season.
Totally agree with you. Me and one of our listeners, Alec, have talked about going to Lambeau Field.
I could not encourage it more. I was there in 2016, Eddie. Absolutely loved the vibe of Green. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. I think it was a November day. I want to say it was Jordan Todman took the opening kickoff back for a touchdown. Luck threw a couple picks, I want to say, early in that game, but the Colts won that. Honestly, one of the better regular season wins of the Pagano era. But again, it's an awesome place. There's no corporate bullshit with it, really. At times I feel like you get into these, modern stadiums, arenas, and it's very corporate-y, and I get it. There's obviously a hefty dollar and a hefty price tag that comes to being in those stadiums, but a lot of it is, much more for the fan experience or just the entertainment experience, I should say, of, no, I want to bring clients to this game, et cetera, et cetera. And I get that top dollar probably pays, but I just love the old school feel to what Lambeau had to offer. It was such a tight tunnel. I remember that as well. It was the road locker or the visiting locker room out onto the field was a very, very small environment there. So, yes, I would say do it, Eddie. I cannot agree more on that.
It's the mecca of NFL stadiums for sure. If you have nothing else to add, let's move on to the Colts 2024 free agent list. Obviously, the biggest name on this list, Michael Pittman Jr. You can't discredit either of the names of Grover Stewart, Kenny Moore, Julian Blackmon on that list either.
No, and again, I have said all along, Eddie will continue to say it as we're a month and a half away from free agency beginning. I think it's the most notable group of free agents. And let's just run down the offensive ones to begin with here, and just kind of in order by position. Gardner Minshew, Zach Moss, at wideout, Michael Pittman Jr., Isaiah McKenzie, and Juwan Winfrey. And then in the O-line, just one. That would be Danny Pinter. Minshew, I think we all need to be realistic about expectations for a backup quarterback. My kind of 2024 QB vision is this. Re-sign a guy of Minshew's ilk, somebody of that sort of resume. I think that's critically important for a team that has expectations as a playoff team. You got to survive any moments without your starter. And I also think it's important when, you can't ignore the injuries that Anthony Richardson suffered this past year. I also think it's important come round 5 or 6, Eddie, to draft a quarterback. I value Shane Steichen's opinion immensely in that realm, and I think getting him a quarterback that he has identified that has some traits that he likes makes a lot of sense. My quarterback opinion has probably changed over the years to where I now think, richer investments, even in the backup to third-string parts, are needed. Sam Ehlinger is still under contract, so it's not like you're in a uber hurry to move on. Kellen Mond, I know, is still on the roster as well. So, quantity-wise, you could probably get by, but that's how I would look at that. Again, I think Minshew, the fact that he knows Steichen, has plenty of familiarity with Anthony Richardson is important. And I look at it as you need a backup that gives you a chance to win a game via a coin flip, and that's Minshew. At the same time, you need one to grow and groom and develop. And that's where I kind of look at the draft pick route there. So I do think Minshew is going to have suitors. I do think he's going to have opportunities for better playing time. And, that could end up being the end-all, be-all of his time here in Indy. But I don't know. I'm a little bit more to value real in-game experience, been there, done that, bright lights aren't too bright compared to, same quarterback stylistically. Mm-hmm. I know some people differ. I know Tyler Huntley has kind of been a popular name people have thrown out there. And, even if you look at his record in Baltimore with a very similar offense, very similar style quarterback, he hasn't had great success when he's gone in there. So I would re-sign Minshew if he wants to come back. Zach Moss, Eddie, it's kind of fascinating to me how the Moss free agency is going to play out. The running back class for 2024 is very deep. It's Derrick Henry, it's Josh Jacobs, it's Tony Pollard, it's Saquon Barkley, it's Austin Eckler. I mean, it's a loaded group. And I guess, how do you kind of want the backup running back? Do you view it and say, hey, Jonathan Taylor's getting up there a little bit, and you need more of that bell cow potential as an insurance policy as your backup? Or do you view it and say, no, I think you want a little bit more spice in that backfield? Again, think of a little Tyler Goodson. I know they still have Evan Hall. So similar to Minshew, I just kind of view Moss as going to have better opportunities elsewhere. Again, backup running backs, there's a part of me that's like, man, don't they kind of grow on trees? I know it's not necessarily maybe the most accurate statement in explaining Zach Moss this season because he certainly helped you out in some very important moments, but that's kind of where I'm at with backup running back. So I'm not married to a return of Moss, but again, you are still going to probably have to go down that path with him there. So I'll be curious to see what the market looks like for Moss. He's probably the 6th or 7th most accomplished running back in this free agency class, but he had a really nice year, and he's going to obviously command a much cheaper deal, you would think, than some of those others out there. Wideout-wise, you guys know how I feel about Pittman. He's the number one here, and that's all that matters. Really. When you have Anthony Richardson, you got to focus on what you've got on your own depth chart. And he is a consistent, reliable presence. He checks everything you want off the field as well. He's not an all-pro wideout, but again, when you have a young quarterback like Richardson, you cannot sacrifice and play the cheap game and, shop down the aisle where, they've got all the fancy little signs that say 50% off and buy one, get one free. No. You can't play that game. You can't play it. So I am adamant about that.
10 for 10.
No matter what. 10 for 10. That is a hell of a deal. McKenzie, Winfrey. Yeah. Whatever. I guess it is a little confusing to me how they cut Tony Brown, but they kept Isaiah McKenzie. I think you bring back Danny Pinter, and I kind of look at that Andy.
Oh, there we go.
I might need to do the 10 for 10 Reese's.
Yeah.
After that comment there. Apologies to Eddie Garrison, Andy Sweeney, my morning co-host on the Wake Up Call. But, Pinter, I kind of view it in like a Jack Mewhort. Remember the Mewhort 1 year?
Yeah.
Taekwon Lewis was on this list. They've done a couple times. That's kind of how I look at Pinter. I've always been intrigued by Pinter. I don't know. Maybe it's a little bit of my
LaRaven Clark.
In-state bias. Yeah, LaRaven Clark is a name. Bring him in, camp body. I don't know. I think he would have made the team. I don't want to act like, he was certainly 1,000% going to be that sixth guy, but I do think he was kind of trending in that way before the season-ending injury. Again, another guy this staff absolutely loves, and the previous staff did as well. So I would bring back Pinter on a very cheap 1-year deal. Anything on the offensive free agents, Eddie Garrison, that stand out to you? Agree, disagree with that group?
I agree with everything you said. I wouldn't want to bring... I understand Zach Moss and Jonathan Taylor were a good pair to have just as an insurance policy, but with the way running backs... You're able to find running backs in the draft now. You still have Tyler Goodson, Evan Hull, and Trey Sermon, who have all produced for you in some capacity. It doesn't make sense to use any of that cap space that you have around $70 million towards $6 to $8 million for a backup running back. I feel like those funds can be allocated elsewhere, but I like your thought and your reasoning on bringing back Taekwon Lewis because I thought Taekwon Lewis had a really, really good year coming off. Was it torn patella again?
Yeah, and we'll get into the defensive free agents here in just a second. I would say one thing to add that you just brought up that I want to get to offensively before we move on. You look at Moss and you look at Minshew. They're going to be on the higher wage scale of backup players at their respective spots. So to your point, how frugal are you going to be? Where's your fiscal situation like? I do think that is something that is really, really important to keep an eye on. And they might not draw the same sort of price tag as some other guys, but if you add that up, Minshew at whatever, and I'm just throwing out numbers here. If Minshew is at $6 million a year and Moss is at $5 million a year, that's combined $11 million. If you took the backup QB and backup running back and you combined it out to be $4 million or $5 million, that gives you another handful to play with. Will that be something that could be at play here? All right, defensively, you brought up Taekwon Lewis. The D-line's got a couple of names: Jannard Avery, Jake Martin, Taven Bryant, Grover Stewart. Nobody at linebacker in the secondary, the two big ones, Kenny Moore and Julian Blackman. And don't forget about Rigoberto Sanchez as well. D-line-wise, I guess we'll just go in order. I actually thought Jannard Avery had a few moments during training camp where I thought he was going to make the football team. Played in the league for a while, 62 career games. How about Jake Martin? What do you remember about Jake Martin's season, Eddie?
Absolutely nothing.
Did everybody have a Jake Martin in their third grade class back in the day?
I did, growing up all the way through high school.
Shout out to the Decatur product, Jake Martin there. How about this Jake Martin played more snaps than Anthony Richardson this year?
That's wild.
191 defensive snaps for Jake Martin. He did have 2 sacks. Taven Bryan obviously was kind of the main backup there. There were moments I'm kind of like, but then there are moments of like, who else with him? Grover Stewart, Eddie is hovering that age 30, but boy, has he been durable. And
productive.
Yes, and productive. And you don't use the word productive with a lot of defensive tackles. You can use, they occupy space and they do their job and they absorb blockers. But yes, productive is the word to use. And that's why I found so difficult about the big 4 free agents. Eddie, when you think about it, Michael Pittman Jr., but then especially the 3 on defense, Grover Stewart, Kenny Moore, Julian Blackmon. You have little to no obvious answers behind them. And I think that is what creates such strong leverage for those 3 individuals. In regards to the Colts, I'm trying to think of a good example of a young player at another spot. But, I know there are times on the roster. Well, how about Marlon Mack to Jonathan Taylor?
Yeah.
And I know Marlon Mack had the injury, but even if he did not, you had a young player that was a pretty obvious passing of the torch to. I don't see that anywhere. Maybe with Nick Cross at safety, but then again, if you're going to say that, it's not like Rodney Thomas II has entrenched himself as a guaranteed locked-in starter there. So I remember saying in last week's podcast, rank the 3 that is the easiest to replace. Who would it be? Would it be Grover? Would it be Kenny? Or would it be Julian? And it's probably Julian, but like all 3 of them, you could make strong cases for being that top, and I think it's a very difficult group to really separate. I think Tyquan Lewis falls in the second tier of free agents, Eddie, that's really important to bring back. He's versatile. How about him playing all 17 games? He had only reached double-digit games in one of his, 5 NFL seasons. Really important for him to play all 17. And if you break down the numbers, he was more disruptive than Kwity Paye. And frankly, It wasn't even close. Wasn't even close. So I do think Tyquan Lewis is important to bring back. Again, we've talked about Kenny Moore. I go back to the Zaire Franklin quote. I tell Kenny all the time, I don't know how it works without you. Kenny has been a guy that's expressed some mutual interest in wanting to be back here. And again, there's just no one behind. Hell, Tony Brown just got cut. I don't know if Chris Lamons is the answer behind them. So, and I'm going to stick by Blackmon. Blackmon's a guy that I would bring back. I know safety is a position, Eddie, that you've gotten into before and found the 1-year stopgaps in free agency, but he just makes me sleep better at night. And I get that you can find guys that can be a little bit stopgappy, a bit band-aidy at that position, but man, he just makes me sleep better at night. And then, of course, in the back of my mind, I start thinking to myself, well, Kevin, you want to bring back Pittman, you want to bring back Grover, you want to bring back Kenny, you want to bring back Julian. How much money you got? Oh, and Gardner's this, and Zach Moss could be that, and Tyquan Lewis could be that, and Rigoberto Sanchez deserves to be re-signed. How about Rigo? Zero touchbacks. 68 punts last year. 0 touchbacks. He actually had a career best in net punting average. I know he got off to a poor start, but I think he had a better year than people thought when you look at it there. So anything on those free agents, Eddie, because, again, I think it is a notable group. I can talk myself into a lot of it, and I know that there will be market values that get assigned to guys, and we might get out of free agency and be like, oh, boy, there's a need there if one of those big 4 walk. And I am open-minded to listening to letting one of those 4 walk and obviously using that money elsewhere in free agency because at the same time, I don't think all those positions are super premium that I just laid out there. But it is easily the most talk yourself into stand on a table to re-sign a lot of these guys that I can recall.
Yes. When looking at the defense as a whole, When you look at the most sure tacklers on the Colts defense, number one, Zaire Franklin. Number two, Kenny Moore for me. He's a guy that's not going to miss often in space. He's going to either make the tackle or he's going to slow the guy down and get a tackle with somebody else.
He plays so much bigger than his size.
Yeah, and the same can be said for Julian Blackmon.
Right.
Like, you have to remember in those early games of his career against Tennessee, the Colts were really good against Derrick Henry and limiting Derrick Henry in large part because they brought Julian Blackmon down a little bit from the safety spot, brought him closer to the line of scrimmage, and he was laying the wood on Derrick Henry and limiting the Titans in the run game. I think those two are very vital in that aspect because you have to think about the struggles the team had in total in tackling last year at times, especially down the stretch. And a large part of that was without Julian Blackmon back there in the secondary. So I would put those two up there with Grover Stewart. But it will all be so fascinating because, like you talked about, you've got $70 million. You need to address some skill positions on the wide receiver, tight end front, because you don't know if you've got the guy in the tight end room or not. And you need to help supply Anthony Richardson, but at the same time, you've got some talented guys that you need to retain. So I do not want to be Chris Ballard, and I don't want to be the guy who has to run the cap and all the numbers for the Colts.
I guess it is probably the most plan A, B, C, D, E, that sort of offseason feel to it when free agency gets underway on the 13th of March. And again, the Shane Steichen presence, I think, is really important to keep in mind as well on, who does he like? How does he kind of view free agency? We saw wideout wise, he wanted a smaller, more of a jittery bug type of component to his offense. That is not something we had seen in the previous regime. So that is another element to it all.
I was going to say all this is on the website, 1075thefan.com.
Yeah, we're going to have, I would say, I try to keep it right around to a handful. Maybe, probably 4 is probably a safer bet. About 4 articles a week up on the website to kind of keep the offseason thirst there for Colts fans.
The thirst.
So we will continue to do that here. Again, none of it is super pressing right now, or I guess fresh news items. But still, I do think there's some quality content up on the website. Obviously, I'm extremely biased. But yeah, you can check that out at 1075thefan.com.
First round of mock drafts are starting to come out, so those will be fun conversations we have in the future. You ready for some Twitter questions?
Let's do it.
All right, only a handful or so to get to. Let's start with Jason. Not to be insensitive, but if Jim Irsay is not in a condition to make business decisions, does that paralyze the Colts' activity during free agency?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think among the list of, Irsay-related thoughts, this has probably got to be on it. Now, I do think this is the quietest January the organization has had in years. Now, there was a part of me, Eddie, that thought, okay, Gus Bradley's under contract. If you were to make a move, would you need Jim Irsay's sign-off on that? That would obviously be a significant financial hit. And, I am of the belief that 90-some% of the day-to-day decisions that get done organizationally right now get sign-off from Carly Irsay. I mean, she is in the building daily, and she's running the show. And if I had to rank kind of the 3 daughters on who would get the most responsibility moving forward, I would say for sure it's got to be Carly, based off, again, how much of a presence she has. But I think from a fiscal, frugal standpoint, cash versus cap, I do think from an ownership standpoint, Jim Irsay's not a guy that's just going to throw out all this cash like a Stan Kroenke might up front, and that allows them to kind of manipulate the cap a little bit more. I would assume the daughters would fall in line to that sort of thinking, but that is a question that you have to be asked. And again, Eddie, that's kind of, I guess, the next big item that we're looking for is if you project out the offseason, really at the Super Bowl, owners attend. So, if you don't see Jim there, obviously that is of continued concern. The Combine, I never really recall him having too much of a public presence at the Combine. The next big one would be the league meetings, and that's in about 2 months. Late March is when you have the league meetings, and that is when, if I'm not mistaken, I think the NFL would even come out and say, hey, for whatever reason, Jim Irsay is not able to be with us, et cetera, et cetera. Carly Irsay-Gordon is the one that is going to be doing the voting on behalf of the Indianapolis Colts, something along those lines there. But Yeah, I would think that it's not going to impact free agency too much. Not to act like every organization's the same, but I think there's an element of sign off from Jim Irsay. Wiggle room on what you can do cap wise, and okay, this is the amount of cash we have. This is the amount of the cap space we have. Make the puzzle fit into this. That's kind of the approach that I would assume he's been given to Mike Bloom, their cap guy, and Chris Ballard as well.
Thank you. I couldn't remember his name when I was talking about being
Mike Bloom.
Cap guy.
Yeah, good dude.
Old Daner is next. Who has the final say on Gus Bradley between Shane Steichen and Chris Ballard? And if he is gone, who would be on your list to fill his spot? Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, and obviously this doesn't look like an item that's going to play out. I do find it interesting that I kind of came down to a half-dozen-person list, Eddie, when I thought about names. Because I didn't just want to say, hey, you got to look into removing Gus Bradley. I think there should be some names that kind of back that up. One of the names I had on the list is now the new DC in Jacksonville, and Ryan Nielsen. He was with Atlanta last year on that staff. The Falcons had a pretty good defense for not having a super namey defense by any means, and now he's joining Doug Peterson's staff with that. I think the first question here is a good one. Who has final say on Gus Bradley between Steichen and Ballard? I would hope it's Steichen. I don't know. Maybe I'm just one that's a big hierarchy person, but I view it as the head coach should have the responsibility of a coaching staff. I mean, they're the ones that deal with those guys the most on a daily basis, and ultimately on game days, Chris Ballard's in the booth. Shane Steichen's right there, 2 feet away from Gus Bradley, so it should be Steichen. I think it's Steichen to answer that question. And again, I go back to the final Manning cast of the year when Peyton's saying to Bruce Arians in regards to Todd Bowles of this is the defense I hated playing against. It's the defense that's exotic. It's the defense that's multiple. It's the defense that I come to the line of scrimmage and I don't know what the hell I'm about to encounter. That's the defense that stresses you. Other defensive coordinators that certainly crossed my mind. I thought about 2 head coaching candidates from last cycle, in Wink Martindale and Ejiro Evero, and we'll see how those processes play out. The rest of the way. But those were a couple that I had thought of. Denard Wilson in Baltimore was a guy that Shane had some overlap with. In Philly, there was another person that Shane had some overlap with that I was trying to think of. I jotted that down. I probably have to look through a couple of my notes there. But those were just a couple of the names that I saw. Honestly, and I know that some people might say is a little Notre Dame bias with this, but Al Golden is the defensive coordinator for Marcus Freeman. He's been in the NFL. Was the linebackers coach, I want to say, with Cincinnati when they won it, or they got to the AFC title game. Notre Dame's defense has been very good under him, so he was somebody that I had thought of as well.
Is that just because he's the Notre Dame guy?
That is not because of that. Chris Harris was the other one.
The cornerback?
The former DB, but there was a rumor of him after Eberflus went to Chicago. And then, Brandon Staley had a great run with the Rams. Is he going to be, kind of in line to go back into the coordinator pool and try to get a head coaching gig after that? You kind of get into this of Josh McDaniels, good offensive coordinator, not a good head coach. Are some of these guys, Brandon Staley, more of a coordinator than he is a head coach. So those were some of the names that I thought about. But yeah, it obviously looks like Gus Bradley is going to be back, and we'll see if there are any other defensive staff changes around him.
So you're pretty organized over there with your notes?
Try to be.
You're not like a high schooler. You use one notebook for all your classes. You've got them all for different classes?
I try to be organized. Binders, right?
Yeah.
Color specific for each classes. I get just a couple things Gus related, because I did post a story about a week ago on him, and I know we haven't had a podcast since then. The consistent pressure, I think, is a big issue. If you look at last year, they were top 10 in sacks, franchise record in sacks, but Eddie, they were 29th in hurry rate, and this is a team that blitzes the least of any in the NFL. So the consistent pressure, get me off my spot. All of a sudden, the 7-on-7 throw, the 11-on-11, hey, boom, 3-step drop, out, 5-step drop, out, 7-step drop, read here, read there, boom. Disrupt that. If you disrupt that, you make quarterbacks play off platform, and some quarterbacks struggle with that. I thought it was a bit tiresome to have, Nico Collins go for a season high, Rashid Shaheed go for a season high, DeAndre Hopkins go for a season high, Puka Nacua, I think it was the second highest of any game this season. Devontae Adams, second highest of any game this season. That, to me, happens too often. I say this with the Pacers. If you look at the Pacers right now, they're on a 3-game losing streak. Jeremy Grant on Friday night goes for his second highest total of the season. So when you face Jeremy Grant this year, his second and third highest point totals of the year are against you. Kevin Durant on Sunday, I think it was the second highest point total he had up to that point of the season when he went off for 40 against you. It's take away the other team's top option to the point where you just make them average. To Grant and Durant's point, they've played, 30-some games this season. Make them have the 14th highest game they've had this season or the 17th highest game they've had this season. To those wideouts that I mentioned, they're good wideouts. Puka Nacua is a very good wideout. Puka Nacua also had a lot of games this year where he only had 80 or 90 yards. Again, I'm not saying you should totally eliminate them and hold them to season lows. I'm not unrealistic with those expectations here, but create more of an average aspect and try and do that at a better rate. And the word continuity kind of rubs me the wrong way when I hear that as a big defense or a big backing of someone. In Shane Steichen's case, if Nick Sirianni believed in continuity, Shane Steichen would never have gotten a chance to call plays in Philly and wouldn't be here in Indy in all likelihood. So to me, it's a little cop-out. I get that there's an element of you want consistency, and that matters, but also when things are not going well, consistency is not necessarily the recipe that has to be followed here. So that was just a couple other Gus items that I put in the story I wanted to make sure that I shared with our pod audience.
Yim. Apparently, this upcoming draft is supposed to be deep at both wideout and cornerback, but not so much at edge. With that being said, do you think edge should be selected with the Colts' first pick and the following 2 rounds should be wideout and corner, or do you think it's more of a best player available situation and they take whatever difference maker is there, even if it's not particularly a position of need? Thanks. Love the pod and tune in every week.
So I am a very much and I do this exercise probably early April each year. I'm a very much of a positional mock draft. Where are your needs most pressing? How does that match up with best player available? Marry those two things. I do think, depth matters when you're breaking ties. And both, I guess, are right there with me. If you're going to boil it down to, wideout or corner or edge, if you said to me, all right, Kevin Bowen, you have to rank them 1, 2, and 3. You have to. What's the most pressing need? I would say edge rusher, wideout, corner. If I had to rank them 1, 2, and 3. Now, again, scarcity at the position, I'm trying to put that to the side when I answer that first question. When I factor in scarcity, it's definitely edge rusher. To me, that's the hardest thing to find out of those 3. And there is a little part of me at corner right now, Eddie, that says this. Should you let Juju Brents, Jalen Jones, and Dallas Flowers figure it out?
At least the first 2 names on that list, I would say yes.
The Achilles injury, I assume, for Dallas is where you have some risk in there. That's fair. And maybe you throw in one more name. You go out there and make a little bit more of a cornerback splash than you did.
Get a veteran.
Year. Yeah. In free agency. So maybe you say, okay, here are 4 names, and those 4 can figure it out because 2 of those 4 will play, assuming you re-sign Kenny Moore. 2 of those 4 will obviously be out there a lot, and inevitably an injury is going to happen, so you're going to have to rely on 3 of those 4. But I kind of feel like I'm there at corner. I still think it's a need, but again, if I did a positional mock draft today, I would not have it round 1 and 15 overall. And the first positional mock or the first mock draft look that I did, I posted to the website on Monday. There were several corner picks at 15, and I looked at it and thought, man, it's just a hair rich for me, especially when you run a system that I don't think is uberly reliant on keeping your corners on islands.
Oh yeah.
Now we didn't see any edge rushers. I didn't love that, and obviously the Brock Bowers debate, could be one that we have a whole lot here over the next few months of several mock drafts had Bowers at 15. Now I know Mel Kiper, for example, I think had him going 5. So Daniel Jeremiah says he's getting to 15. Mel Kiper says he's gone at 5. So obviously that will dictate a lot. But how do you view tight end? Because I look at tight end a lot of ways, Eddie. Look at the final 4 teams and the tight ends they got. studs.
Mm-hmm.
Sam Laporta, early second round. Travis Kelce in the third round. Mark Andrews in the third round. George Kittle in the fifth. So none of those guys were top 30 picks.
Mm-hmm. Of course, you had Dalton Kincaid as one of the 8 finalists, too.
With Buffalo. So I look at that, and then I think, man, haven't the Colts kind of drafted a bunch of tight ends in that realm? I mean, if you look at the Colts tight ends, Jelani Woods was a third-round pick. Kylan Granson was a fourth-rounder.
Mm-hmm.
Will Mallory is a fifth-rounder. Drew Ogletree was a sixth-rounder. They've drafted a lot of tight ends here as of late, and obviously the Ogletree thing off the field is going to have to play out. And Mo Alley Cox technically is still under contract.
Mm-hmm.
Now you could save a little money if you parted ways, but I didn't get the vibe. I don't know if Ballard ever even mentioned tight end in the season-ending presser a couple weeks ago.
Mm-mm.
So now when you say more explosive, Brock Bowers can give you that.
Oh, yeah.
So I'm probably a little bit more of I'd be okay with taking him there. But I also can view tight end as, and again, labeling Bowers strictly as a tight end might be unfair, but I think you can view tight end in the spot of you can find answers on day 2, even day 3 at that spot. So that's going to be a fascinating one to see how the NFL views Bowers and to see how the Colts even view him as well. But I would say the early returns on this draft, going back to Yem, is probably pretty deep at wideout and even a little bit of corner as well. Pass rusher is much more of a question mark.
Colts Fish, he's the first of 3 that we have left. I know you said you wouldn't pick up Kwity Paye's 5th-year option, so it got me looking more into the cost. It would be about $14 million. The exact number that he gave was $13,856,000 for his 5th year, fully guaranteed, since he didn't meet the criteria for a higher salary. He's been a good run defender, but just an average pass rusher so far. He was very raw coming out of Michigan with great athleticism. I would be inclined to pick up his option as I still believe he can make gains over the next 2 seasons. Oof. Either way, we'll be interested to see what Ballard chooses. Thanks.
$13.8 million, Eddie. That is the 5th-year team option for 2025 for Kwity Paye. That is a big number.
Could you convince somebody during draft time to trade for him, and you get some sort of compensation, and you use that to move up in the first round to get a guy that you love, maybe?
Boy, I don't.
You open up some cap space. Next thing you know, you've got a little more room to sign somebody like a Brian Burns.
I like a lot of the thought behind that. I don't know what exactly fair compensation would be for Paye.
Yeah.
And again, you got to go off some of Ballard's comments. I think Ballard's higher on Paye than I am. I think he really likes what he brings as a run defender. I'd rather see him in a prove-it contract year. Might it cost me a little bit of money on the end? Sure, but I'd rather see him have to play out that contract and prove it. $13.8 million on the books is a lot if he does not take the jump.
Oh, yeah.
And again, we're now going on, we're going on about 6 years of a little bit of the slobbering over the athletic testing traits and the sack production not being there.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, Michigan and then now here in the NFL. And again, it's the consistent rushes for me. I brought up the Tyquan Lewis, for example, okay? Eddie, this past season, Kwity Paye, 8 tackles for loss, 9 quarterback hits. Tyquan Lewis, 9 tackles for loss, 13 quarterback hits. So very similar tackle for loss numbers. Tyquan Lewis with 4 more QB hits than Kwity Paye. Snap counts for the two. 700 for Paye, 436 for Tyquan.
And did you list their sack numbers?
Sacks are what?
8.5 for Kwity, 4 for Tyquan.
Right. And I'd go tackles for loss, QB hits. Again, to me, it's more of the consistent disruption numbers. You get into pressure stuff, you get into hurry stuff, those sorts of things. When you get a little bit deeper into those numbers, Dayo Odengbo, certainly, he played a lot more snaps than Tyquan, but he had much, very similar numbers to Tyquan. More snaps, but not as many as Kwity. Again, there were moments late in the year where I didn't even see Kwity on the field for some third down moments because I just don't think he had earned it, or other guys, I should say, probably have earned it more than him. So I'd be willing to bet on it. And I guess the good news, Eddie, is this. You got to pick up that 5th-year option by what, May 3rd or May 5th? It's after the draft. I think it's that first week after the draft. So maybe if you get out of the draft and you haven't selected a guy early, maybe you pick that up. But IMA, you've got to earn the fifth-year option. That is a big deal. It's a big pay increase. Look at the $13.8 million and compare that to some other defensive ends, edge rushers. It's a notable number. And to me, he has not earned that. So, might it bite me down the road a little bit? Sure, but that obviously will be a good problem to run into and a good problem to have there with that. So that's kind of how I view pay when it comes to, again, consistent pressures. If you sacks are the sack, and I don't know. I think this audience that I'm talking to is a very intelligent audience. I don't think it's a group that just looks at sacks and thinks that's the end all be all. 8.5 sacks is a nice number, certainly, but when you look at the consistent pressure, you're getting into the 70s, 80s, 90s, hundreds of defenders that had better consistent pressure rates than Kwity Paye this past year.
That would put him as the 20th edge rusher in terms of average salary per year at $13.86 million.
And again, we're talking about a guy that right around, I should probably double check and look at this, see if I can find it really, really quick. The more of the other pressure rate numbers from Kwity. Go ahead and ask the next question. I'll try and find that.
Some players around that $13.86 million that you're looking at right now: Josh Sweat of the Eagles, DeMarcus Lawrence of the Cowboys, Cameron Jordan and Carl Granderson of the Saints, Preston Smith of the Packers, and Marcus Davenport for the Vikings. All of those players, $13 million.
78th in pressures for Kwity last year, 185th in quarterback knockdowns, 33rd in sacks. So again, those consistent pressure numbers, that's what I'll keep on coming back to with that. And Dio and Taekwon, outstanding.
Not to mention there's the development of Adi Tamiwa Adebare as well to look out for. I think
he's a little more interior.
Yeah, probably.
Than Kwity, but again, finding the bending edge, still a need.
2 questions left. Chris, I always thought Danny Pinter has played well at center in previous years. I've thought he's been subpar at guard, but I always thought he looked good at center. I'm not certainly an expert and was wondering what your thoughts about Pinter are.
Yeah, I should probably turn on my mic. I would bring him back. Cheap, Mewhort, Taekwon, 1-year deal, nice insurance policy. I also think kind of 5th and 6th round, Eddie, probably makes sense to go a little bit interior as well. When you get in that day 3, some positions that kind of stand out to me, it's probably time to draft a linebacker. Just tap into the Chris Ballard guarantee of finding a successful linebacker that he's done so well of over the years. And then also, can you get a little bit into that interior line, backup quarterback, those sorts of things as well.
Final Twitter question comes from Wake Spike. Should we feel better about or more terrified after seeing the Browns being dismantled in the wild card round?
I'm guessing this is in reference to the Texans.
Yeah.
And possibly being in that opportunity. I hate to get into one game overreactions. I think you're kind of laid out leading into the Texans game and after it, just how big of a bummer it was to have the missed opportunity of a home playoff game of a Cleveland team that obviously has had plenty of ups and downs. And, I would say watching Houston in the season finale, watching them in their first playoff game, you are reminded of this. 1-53, I think the Colts probably have the deeper roster. Probably have the more talented roster.
Yep.
Where Houston separates themselves, though, is they have the premium positions figured out.
Yep.
Largely figured out. And the Colts right now, they did take a step forward in this past season, but they don't. And they haven't been there in the Chris Ballard era. Whether you look at C.J. Stroud at quarterback or Nico Collins at wideout or Laramie Tunsil at left tackle or Will Anderson Jr. at defensive end or Derek Stingley Jr. at corner, they can really check all of those boxes. And a lot of it is youth, man.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody's under 25 besides Tunsil. So that is super encouraging if you are a Texans fan. Now, they still need to support, and they still need to, obviously, they made a huge trade in the draft, and, the Bobby Slowick. Right now, Colts fans should be cheering for Bobby Slowick to go get a head coaching gig. Because, again, the lack of stability there, Does that impact C.J. Stroud at all moving forward? Whereas when the Jim Bob Cooter rumor was out there about him to Philly, I really didn't pay much attention to it, Eddie, because, and this is unfair to Jim Bob Cooter, but I kind of thought about, who cares? They got Steichen.
Yeah.
Like, you're not as worried here in this market because you have that guy in place and you know he's not going anywhere. Unlike Houston, where they could be playing that song and dance for years to come.
Yeah.
If Stroud continues to perform at that level. So, to me, if you just want to boil it down to Texans/Colts, it honestly was a reminder of kind of the age-old Ballard question. There are a lot of good and talented players on Chris Ballard rosters. A lot of them. He's drafted some very good football players. But all 22 positions were not created the same.
No.
And that's what you've ran into here, where Houston has had more of an emphasis on it, and they've obviously had some very high draft picks to get those players and then made a huge trade to get Anderson. But, Nico Collins as a third-round find is huge for him. And again, I said the Colts have taken steps in the right direction because they, in my opinion, have got a third-round find on their end in Bernhard Raimann at left tackle. I think that is an answer. So that is very, very important for this franchise to make sure that you continue to try and find that and continue to invest in those positions.
Might get a lot of hate or mean tweets for this, but you know who C.J. Stroud reminds me of?
Who is that?
12.
Yeah, I could see that.
Just the smoothness.
Boy, he's a smooth operator.
Delivering from the pocket.
Yeah, poise.
Everything is just on target. He hardly makes mistakes. The only major difference, Stroud doesn't put himself in compromised positions outside the pocket.
Yeah, Stroud is Stroud gets it. He just gets it.
Oh, yeah.
And to be in that moment, and whether it was the throw to Nico to start the game or certainly the plays on that second to last drive, and he is a special talent. And he got rocked early last season. And about 6 sacks Baltimore week 1. I think Colts had 6 in week 2, and the big hit number. And to bounce back from that and have the injuries that he had and those around him had as well, all the O-line issues that they had in front of him. I've joked before, the AFC South is the true TV of quarterback divisions. It's no longer that. And just in general, quarterbacks in the AFC, Eddie. I mean, right here in our little bubble, when's the last time you've had every organization feel like the head coach and quarterback is somewhat solved?
Oh, boy.
And again, it's varying degrees of it. I'm not saying all of them should feel as comfortable as they do.
Ever?
But DeMeco Ryans and C.J. Stroud, Shane Steichen and Anthony Richardson, Trevor Lawrence and Doug Peterson, Brian Callahan and Will Levis. Obviously, that would be fourth on the list, but still, they've attempted to create, their own Steichen situation there. The division is on the right path.
Yeah.
And obviously the Colts are as well. But then again, this conference. I mean, you had Burrow, Trevor Lawrence, and Herbert watching the playoffs.
Yeah.
You think those are 3 dudes that are going to be consistent playoff type QBs moving forward? At least 2 of the 3? I mean, so it is a golden era of AFC quarterback depth.
And Deshaun Watson watching as well. I know he didn't play well at all last year, but
right. But their team made it. I was basically saying QBs and teams that didn't make it. I know some could say Aaron Rodgers.
Yeah.
Obviously, he's not on the youth meter that some of the others are, but it's quite the time to be an AFC fan, AFC South fan, et cetera, et cetera. Eddie Garrison, have a great week, brother.
Who you got in the conference championship games?
Ooh, the heart is saying let's go Fighting Dan Campbell's. Is Debo playing?
I don't know.
Have you seen the Debo numbers with or without him?
Oh, it's staggering.
He suffered that hairline fracture in a game. They scored 17. They scored 17 each of the next 2 weeks without him. And if you look at with him in the lineup, it's like 30 or 40 falling out of bed, seemingly every week.
I bet Green Bay to win as soon as Debo went out.
I think that was a smart. Obviously, he didn't win it, but I totally get why you would have done that.
I bet Joe Barry.
I want to go Lions and Ravens, but my head says 49ers and Chiefs. A few weeks ago, I bet Ravens to beat 49ers in the Super Bowl. Wasn't like great odds, but you can do the matchup and the win. So
was this to make up for the Dallas Cowboys?
This was to make up for the Cowboys
and the Raiders from last year.
I wanted to, yeah. Next year. I had Jets this year along with the Cowboys, by the way, in case anyone forgot on that end. I'll go Lions-Ravens.
I'm sticking with my preseason prediction that you asked me for. Baltimore, San Francisco. And I told you then Baltimore was going to win the Super Bowl. I should have placed money on it.
You know, think about Baltimore is like, what are they going to look like with Mark Andrews? He's been the most consistent target guy. I do think a couple things to note on these championship games. The Lions have allowed a bunch of random quarterbacks to torch them lately.
And they've struggled in Jared Goff era in outdoor stadiums.
Now going on the road, when does that emotional it seems like they're on just such an emotional ride. Does that end it all for them? Now, again, I think the Debo injury is huge. And then you flip over to Baltimore. It's amazing to me. I saw a stat where Baltimore entering the playoffs, they had beat, I think 11 of their wins had been over teams with better than 500 record.
Yeah.
Most in the history of the NFL.
And they've led every game in the final 2 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, it's astonishing what they've been like. And
that defense, I don't think has rightfully deserved the credit that it should be given. And it has been absolutely dominating.
Can they play the keep away game a little bit better than Buffalo did? I think they can. Again, I'll go Detroit-Baltimore, but I certainly hear you out on that end. Cannot wait for it. Hopefully we get two good ones leading into the Super Bowl. He's Eddie Garrison. I'm Kevin Bowen. Everybody have a great week. We'll be back next week with another edition of Kevin's Corner.